a great honor for me to introduce one of my colleagues from George Mason University, J.W. Verrett. J.W. is Assistant Professor of Law at George Mason University. He's written extensively on corporate governance issues and publishes research in leading journals such as the Yale Journal on Regulation and the Delaware Journal of Corporate Law. Professor Verrett earned his JD and his master's degree in public policy, both from Harvard University. Very impressive. And he's currently on leave from George Mason, serving as senior counsel and chief economist for the Financial Services Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives. Please help me in welcoming Professor Verrett.
Thank you, Dina. I appreciate that, and it's good to be back among friends here at the Mercatus Center. Whenever the chairman asks me a question that I don't know the answer to, which is often, I have Mercatus and Cato on speed dial. I thought the best way to introduce the chairman to all of you would be to talk about my introduction to working for the chairman and for his committee. When I went to my dean to ask for leave to come and take this job, I believe my dean's here somewhere, the dean said, look, you can do this, but make sure you don't get your academic career off track. Keep up with the academic literature. And I thought, easier said than done while working on the Hill, but okay, we'll give it a shot. In my first day, I was told, you need to do a memo for the chairman, and it needs to be at least 50 pages long. It needs a few hundred footnotes. And I thought, wow, that's not what they do on the West Wing, but I'll give it a shot, and that sounds promising. So I did it, and I thought surely a chairman of a committee isn't going to have time to read all of that. And I was wrong, and the way I know I was wrong was the 7 a.m. email the next day. I read in your footnote 100 that you cited a couple of papers, but there's a couple other papers in the American Economic Review that you didn't cite, and why don't you come up and talk about it with me at 9 o'clock? And folks, I have to come clean. I hadn't read the papers that I cited, much less the ones that I didn't know about. So my first thought was, I sure hope this guy believes in second impressions. But my second thought, and my enduring thought, was what a privilege to work for someone who reaches for all of it every single time when it comes to thinking through policy problems. So I'm able to faithfully report to Dean Polsby, this has not been a sidetrack from my academic career. In fact, it's been a chance to study under a senior scholar, and so that's why it's been such a great opportunity and why it's my privilege to introduce him today. So please join me in welcoming the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, Jeb Hensarling.
Well, J.W., thank you very much. I have no idea if that story is true, but it's certainly entertaining. It's an honor to be here. As I was walking in the door, somebody thanked me for being here, and I assured them anything that Mercatus and Cato were involved in, I would like to be in their midst. I can think of two no greater, more prestigious free market think tanks than Mercatus and Cato. So thanks for inviting me. It's an honor. It's also an honor every time we have one of your scholars come and appear before our committee. In fact, my staff has joked we do it so often that we need to find you some office space over on the Hill. Don't know we'll go that far, but it's been brought to my attention. It's also been brought to my attention that you've had a long day, and I am your last speaker. Perhaps standing between you and a cold beer, I don't know. I would like to tell you, I would intend to be brief, but I'm a politician and I'm incapable of being brief. So please make yourself comfortable. Anyway, as chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, I've been asked to speak to you today about what your organizers call a post-Dodd-Frank world. Please appreciate the fact that I appreciate the optimism implicit in the topic's title. I certainly hope to live long enough to see a post-Dodd-Frank world. But as we approach the 4th anniversary of that act, and there's still so much more red tape to come, I'm not really sure when the post-Dodd-Frank world arrives. So my comments may be a little bit less than clairvoyant about the brave new post-Dodd-Frank world. But look at it this way. You certainly saved a whole lot of money by asking me to speak and not Hillary Clinton. Yeah, go ahead. I sure hope that's my water and not the last speaker's. But anyway, speaking of Mrs. Clinton, you probably heard about her book tour. In part of that, she has said she still doesn't know if she's running for president. I just find it fascinating in a nation of 300 million people, she's the only one who doesn't know she's running for president. Anyway, let me attempt to now be serious and address the topic at hand. Again, we do not know when the post-Dodd-Frank world will arrive, but I do know how to navigate the approach to this brave new world, and in a phrase, it is principled leadership. And when I think of principled leadership, I recall an anecdote about Margaret Thatcher. I don't recall who shared it with me. She was attending a conservative party policy meeting in the 1970s, and another conservative, albeit a wobbly one, was giving a speech. And in the speech, he argued that conservatives could only win the next election if they abandoned certain principles and adopted new beliefs. Well, as you can well imagine, the Iron Lady would have none of that, and even before the speaker finished his presentation, she reached into her handbag, she grabbed a copy of Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, she picked it up for all to see, and then she slammed it on the table and said, "This is what we believe." She did that as a reminder that in challenging times, you must have leaders who stand firmly for the timeless principles and values upon which our constitutional republic stands: freedom, free markets, private property, and the rule of law. Now, I will admit that on more than one occasion, I've wanted to channel Maggie. Many of you know I spent last Congress as the chairman of the House Republican Conference, and it was my responsibility and my privilege to preside over conference meetings. On more than one occasion, frankly, on too many occasions, I was subjected to some colleague with a tremble in his voice telling the rest of us that principled positions that we have must be modified or we risk losing the majority. I daydreamed of banging down on the table, not the constitutional liberty, but my personal copies of The Road to Serfdom and Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, and shouting, "This is what we believe." And then adding to it a rhetorical question posed often by my dear friend and mentor, Phil Gramm. I would remind that speaker, why would anybody want a fake Democrat when they could have the real thing? Ladies and gentlemen, we will not accept the Dodd-Frank world, and the pathway to a post-Dodd-Frank world is emblazoned with the names of Hayek and Friedman. This is what we believe. Now, it's become fashionable for those on the left to dismiss those of us who speak of principles as ideologues. And you know, when the left runs out of logic and facts and proof or persuasion, and it usually doesn't take that long, then begins the name calling. Usually starts out kind of mild, Tea Party sympathizer. Then we're up to ideologue, and if they really get wound up, they end up playing the race card. You can almost set your watch by it. But when we principled conservatives, when we say that free enterprise have lifted more people out of poverty than all the government anti-poverty programs combined, this claim's not based on ideology. It's not based on theory. It's based on history and evidence. When Adam was a small business owner in Mineola, Texas, in the 5th Congressional District that I have the privilege of representing, sends me an email saying he won't be hiring any more workers because, quote, "the complexity of all the different rules and regulations that the government imposes creates a climate of incomprehensible confusion and uncertainty." He's not telling me about ideology. He's reporting about the ugly reality of the Dodd-Frank-like Washington red tape that he has to live with. When Felicia, a worried mom from Forney, Texas, also in the 5th District, tells me that she's struggling to care for her son because, quote, every time we turn around, the cost of something else increases, our insurance premiums, our grocery bills, our utility bills, our fuel bills. You know, that's not being based on economic theory. That's her Dodd-Frank life, and that's millions of Americans' lives right now. So when Margaret Thatcher had the opportunity to put Hayek and Friedman to work, she ushered in a new generation of middle-class prosperity in Britain. She privatized 50 state-run companies, railways to Still, telecom to British Air, revitalizing the economy and making lives better. Before the Thatcher privatization wave, the idea of owning stocks was reserved for the idle rich in the clubby atmosphere of a private box at Wimbledon. Only 3 million Britons were shareholders, but by the end of Thatcher's term, stock ownership had become as common as the local pub. More than 12 million Britons owned share of companies in a growing British economy. As one British observer noted upon her death, Margaret Thatcher took control of a country that was seemingly in a permanent state of decline, and with a consistent and clear political philosophy, took the risk that were necessary to enable people to be free and create wealth that changes the fortunes of a nation. In effect, she did not want the government to continue to try to run Britain, but let the British people have a go at it. The principles of free market conservatism are sound, not because they have been brilliantly articulated by Hayek and Friedman. They are sound because generations in experience have proved that no other system can lift more ordinary people to extraordinary results of fulfillment, success, happiness, and shared prosperity. History, ladies and gentlemen, is the beginning of the path to a post-Dodd-Frank world. But unfortunately, as we have seen with the left's narrative of the financial crisis, history does not have to be proven to become established, just repeated over and over and over again. The left's false narrative of the financial crisis reminds me of a famous Churchill quote. You may be familiar with it. Quote, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." Ladies and gentlemen, we have allowed liberals to write the history of the 2008 financial crisis, and regrettably, it has been kind to them. In their version of history, an alchemy of Wall Street greed, outside risk, and massive Washington deregulation almost blew up the planet, and this has necessitated massive taxpayer bailouts and a functional occupation of our capital markets by the federal government. The narrative is false. First, financial regulation did not decrease in the decade leading up to the crisis. It markedly increased. A report by this outfit you may have heard of, the Mercatus Center, has noted unassailably that total regulatory restrictions pertaining to the financial services sector grew every single year between 1999 and 2008. And in fact, in the 2 decades preceding the onset of the financial crisis, was a sustained period of more legislative activity that gave regulators more powers, new powers over banks, mortgage lenders, and other financial services. The FDIC Improvement Act of '91, the Home Ownership and Equity Protection Act of '94, the 2001 Bank Secrecy Act, Sarbanes-Oxley of 2002, the Fair and Accurate Credit Transaction Act of 2003. Regardless of their purported benefits or their actual benefits, all of this legislation was costly, complex, and burdensome. All of this was designed to help prevent a crisis. All of this failed. To make matters worse, in 1988, U.S. banking regulators promulgated a series of regulations under the Basel Capital Accords. Not only were these rules also overly complex and costly, but their badly misguided risk weights encouraged banks to crowd into subprime-backed mortgages and sovereign debt. Think Fannie and Freddie, think Greek bonds. After reviewing the facts, it becomes apparent that the financial crisis resulted not from deregulation or a lack of regulation, but instead from dumb regulation. In a phrase, one of the great tragedies of the financial crisis was not that Washington failed to prevent the crisis, but instead Washington helped lead us into it. Among the bad regulation by design or execution that helped set the stage for the financial crisis and made it worse include the following. Perhaps one of the most damaging and misguided policies has been the Community Reinvestment Act. Though small in volume, CRA loan mandates were large in precedent. They inherently required lending institutions to abandon their traditional underwriting standards to comply with this government mandate. CRA implicitly put the government's good housekeeping seal of approval on bad subprime loans. Next, the credit rating agencies. With the benefit of competitive advantages conferred upon them by the state, the rating agency oligopoly freely bestowed AAA ratings on asset-backed securities comprised of unsustainable subprime mortgages. This helped inflate the housing bubble, fueled speculative excesses in our financial markets. Now, perhaps not forgivable, but certainly understandable, investors then placed blind faith in the rating agency's assessments of default risk, given that they also enjoyed the good housekeeping seal of approval from the federal government. We all know Washington promoted even more moral hazard, protecting Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and encouraging them to make bad loans through their mandatory affordable housing goals, put on steroids. Let us recall that 70%, frankly over the 70% of subprime and Alt-A mortgages that led to the crisis were backed by Fannie and Freddie, the FHA, and other taxpayer-backed programs. If you have to point to the root cause of the financial crisis, ladies and gentlemen, this is it. Despite the inherent dangers in such transactions, Fannie and Freddie supporters in Congress kept encouraging them to, quote, roll the dice a little bit more. Well, they did. Taxpayers lost. Our economy lost. They lost big. The result? The mother of all bailouts. Nearly $200 billion for Fannie and Freddie, the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Clearly, the Financial Reserve pitched in and did their part, mainly by maintaining highly accommodative monetary policy that dramatically lowered interest rates, kept them low, again, inflating the housing bubble. Now let's turn to the narrative of the left dealing with risk, outsized risks by financial institutions. As Hayek explained in The Road to Serfdom, the willingness to bear risk is one of the central ideas upon which society rests. Risk is an essential element of personal liberty and market prosperity. To take away risk from the financial system is to take away the opportunity for success. We all know when you go out on the limb, two things can happen. The limb can break, or maybe you just reach the juicy fruit on the end. For the same reason, don't we want financial firms to take risk? Not long ago, one of the largest investment banks took a risk on Apple when it was floundering. Now, Apple is one of the most valuable companies in the world, and its products have revolutionized our lives and our economy. Without financial risk, we lose innovation, but even more fundamentally, in America, if you lose your ability to fail, you will soon lose your ability to succeed. Now, for those who still believe that Washington ought to be the final arbiter of acceptable levels of risk, they should first consider, is Washington even competent to manage risk? A review of the federal government's track record in this area does not inspire confidence. The National Flood Insurance Program is $24 billion underwater. Yes, the pun was intended. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation is running a total asset deficit of approximately $34 billion. Federal Housing Administration recently received an infusion of funds, bailout funds, from the Treasury, despite repeated assurances from the Obama administration that such a bailout would not be needed. Again, regulators encourage banks to load up on sovereign debt and agency MBS by requiring little or no capital be reserved against them. Again, it was the government's misguided and risky affordable housing mandate that principally loosened prudent underwriting standards in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, government not only did not mitigate the risk, they created the risk. Now let's turn to that part of the left's narrative about greed. It's an article of faith on the left that Wall Street greed caused the crisis. My question to them is, when hasn't there been greed on Wall Street? Pray tell, how might that be the determining factor? They also fail to acknowledge there's something called Washington greed. The lust for control over others, the greed of bureaucrats for more power over an ever-increasing share of our economy, our lives, and our liberty. Dodd-Frank is the absolute epitome of Washington greed. In medicine, if you get the diagnosis wrong, you ultimately get the remedy wrong. The same is proven true of the financial crisis. Since Washington got the cause of the crisis wrong, it prescribed Dodd-Frank, an act best captured by Rahm Emanuel's infamous adage, quote, never let a good crisis go to waste. And they didn't. With all due respect to its authors and admirers, Dodd-Frank stands as a monument to the arrogance and hubris of man in that its answer to incomprehensible complexity is yet more incomprehensible complexity. The 400-plus regulations required by Dodd-Frank generally fall into two categories, those that create uncertainty and those that create certain harm. Dodd-Frank is every bit as far-reaching in its harmful consequences for the American economy as Obamacare. Dodd-Frank grants sweeping powers to regulators more appropriate to a Soviet-style command and control economy than a system of free enterprise. No doubt, Dodd-Frank's ultimate purpose for the left is to render effective control of our capital markets to the state, to turn large money center banks into functional utilities so that the state can allocate credit within our economy to politically favored classes. This should be a frightening proposition for any freedom-loving America. Now, I know you've heard about them all day, and we'll hear more about them tomorrow, but permit me to mention just a few of the ways Dodd-Frank assaults our freedom and prosperity. One of the most glaring examples is the creation of the Orwellian name Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Orwellian because the CFPB represents an assault on the fundamental liberties of the American citizenry. Arguably, it is the most powerful and least accountable government agency in the history of our republic. Consumers want and deserve control over their economic decision-making. They want more decisions for themselves and their family. Yet when it comes to their credit cards, their auto loans, their mortgages, the CFPB director has unbridled, unilateral, unprecedented discretionary power, not only to make them less available and more expensive, but to absolutely take them away. There's only one way to protect consumers, and that is to foster transparent, competitive, innovative markets and then to vigorously police them for force, for fraud, and deception. Now, ironically, while the Obama administration habitually cites the purported dangers to financial stability posed by the, quote, shadow banking system, they seem to ignore those presented by the shadow regulatory system. The unaccountable CFPB is part of that shadowy system, as is another Dodd-Frank creation, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, known as FSOC. FSOC, as you probably know, can designate practically any large financial firm in America as, quote, systemically important financial institution, SIFI, a dreaded disease, and thus render effective control over it. Thus, it has the ability, FSOC, to render great damage to our economy and set back the dreams of tens of millions of unemployed and underemployed Americans who are counting on their capital markets to work for them. Recently, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, the former director of CBO, estimated that designating asset managers as SIFIs could cost investors as much as 25% of the return on their investments, approximately $108,000 per investor over the long term. In other words, as it operates in the shadows, FSOC can take away the seed capital necessary to launch a small business or send a child to college. Next, Dodd-Frank presents us with a 932-page, confounding, confusing, convoluted Volcker Rule. Like the rest of Dodd-Frank, the Volcker Rule is aimed at Wall Street, hits Main Street, and regrettably, lower and moderate income Americans become collateral damage. The Volcker Rule is a solution in search of a problem. Of the 450 financial institutions that failed during or as a result of the financial crisis, not one failed because of proprietary trading. In fact, the financial institutions that varied their revenue streams were better able to weather the storm, keep lending going, and support job growth. I am unaware of any regulator or economist who has been able to quantify precisely the Volcker Rule's benefits, but the evidence mounts about its cost. Research out of Washington University, for example, estimates that the Volcker will take $800 billion with a B, out of our economy, the equivalent of $6,900 out of every American household's take-home pay. Never before in my lifetime do I remember a time when the challenges of upward mobility and economic opportunity have been greater. Not surprisingly, I also do not ever recall in my lifetime when the regulatory red tape burdens on our job creators and our capital markets have been greater. Undoubtedly, there is a clear, direct causal link between the two, and exhibit number one is Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank is not only harmful for what it does, it is harmful for what it doesn't do. Clearly, Dodd-Frank does not end too big to fail or taxpayer bailouts. Not even Tim Geithner believed his own talking points on that one. Dodd-Frank codifies bailouts into law. Dodd-Frank designates an entire category of too big to fail Wall Street firms and then creates a taxpayer-financed bailout fund for their use. Now, not long after the financial crisis, we heard the cry from the left, "Occupy Wall Street." Most Americans don't want to occupy Wall Street. They just want to quit bailing it out. So what are the ultimate results of Dodd-Frank? Sadly, less freedom, less opportunity, and a less dynamic economy. Thanks to Dodd-Frank's CFPB qualified mortgage rule, it is now harder for low and moderate income Americans to buy a home. Thanks to Dodd-Frank's crushing regulatory burden, there are fewer community banks serving our rural areas, our small businesses, and our families. Thanks to the end-user margin requirements imposed by Dodd-Frank, Main Street businesses and farmers all across our nation face higher cost in managing their risk, producing their products, costs which ultimately are passed on to their customers and felt by every American family at their kitchen table. Thanks to Dodd-Frank's Volcker rule, U.S. capital markets are far less liquid than before, making it more expensive for U.S. companies to raise working capital, harming Americans saving for retirement and their children's education. Thanks to Dodd-Frank's FSOC, U.S. insurance company that pose no discernible systemic risk to our economy are being subjected to intrusive, unnecessary regulation, drying up capital for infrastructure projects and harming both investors and policyholders. Thanks to Dodd-Frank's Durbin Amendment, services that bank customers once took for granted, like free checking, are being curtailed and eliminated. Dodd-Frank is one of the linchpins of an Obama economic strategy that has brought America the slowest, weakest, non-recovery recovery since the Great Depression, and our people continue to suffer. Every dollar that Washington forces job creators to spend on harmful red tape, devised by a vast, largely unaccountable, unelected bureaucracy, is one less dollar that can be spent to expand, innovate, and hire workers. The numbers help tell the Dodd-Frank story. 16 million Americans unemployed or underemployed. A labor force participation rate of 62.8%, lowest in 3 decades. Small business startups, lowest level in 20 years. But the harmful consequences aren't theoretical. They're real. Not for people who are in my district. Joseph of Maybank, he wrote me, quote, "I'm a disabled veteran and have been without work for over a year. All I want is to have a good paying job and let the rest happen as it comes." Are people like Claudia of Mineola, who shared with me that she was laid off for 9 months before she finally found a job, one that pays her 25% less than her previous job and added 60 miles to her daily commute. She told me, quote, "I don't have the American taxpayers bailing me out." If Washington truly cares about the Josephs, the Claudias, the ranks of the underemployed and the unemployed, it's time to start repealing laws like Dodd-Frank that harm them. Ladies and gentlemen, it is free enterprise, not industrial policy, not crony capitalism, that has made America the fairest, most prosperous, most creative, most generous, and most compassionate nation the world has ever known. No other economic system allows people to earn their success. No other system generates greater shared prosperity. Only free enterprise is moral. Only free enterprise is based on merit. Not Dodd-Frank, not Obamacare, not the IRS, not the EPA, not the stimulus, not the national debt, and certainly not the president's pen and phone. Only economic freedom empowers the poor, the unemployed, the underemployed. Only free enterprise can lift them from poverty to prosperity. As that world-famous economist U2's lead singer Bono has stated, in dealing with poverty here and around the world, welfare and foreign aid are a Band-Aid. Free enterprise is a cure. I knew there was a reason I liked that band. Again, anyone searching for an antidote to Dodd-Frank should look no further than Hayek and Friedman and perhaps Bono. At the House Financial Services Committee, this is what we believe. Let me tell you what we've done. First, our committee has guided more than 20 regulatory relief bills to House passage so far. Everything from bipartisan legislation to relieve Dodd-Frank burdens that make it more difficult to invest in small companies to bipartisan legislation. It streamlines regulations so small business owners can sell their enterprises rather than close them when they retire. Another bipartisan bill ensuring that the SEC and CFTC work together on swap transaction rules so our international competitiveness isn't harmed. Regulatory relief is the bread and butter of the House Financial Services Committee. Importantly, we have also passed a sweeping market-oriented housing finance bill, the PATH Act, which will create a truly sustainable housing finance system for the American people. One that provides more consumers with more choices to buy homes they can actually afford to keep. Not to mention one that takes us off the destructive government-induced boom, bust, and bailout cycle. Next, I'm announcing that soon our committee will mark up the first legislative proposal as part of our Federal Reserve Centennial Oversight Project, a bill that begins to reinvigorate the Fed with the type of accountability and transparency that Congress and the people and the founders expected of all federal agencies. Our committee will soon take up legislation to end Dodd-Frank's bailout fund and bring an end to the reign of those who consider themselves too big to fail. To summarize our activities, by the end of this conference, our committee would have repealed Dodd-Frank's greatest sin of omission, its failure to do anything about housing finance reform, and its greatest sin of commission, enshrining bailouts into law. And day in and day out, you can rest assured, we will continue to work to relieve our economy from the burden of growth-choking, job-killing red tape. To close, our movement cares about Claudia and Joseph and all the underemployed, unemployed, and struggling citizens wondering how they're going to make ends meet. It's because we care that we believe in Hayek and Friedman. Yes, this is what we believe, and we will not rest until all of our citizens have freedom, opportunity, and prosperity. Thank you very much. Well, I'm supposed to stay up here. I don't know it. We done? Okay, you want me to take a few questions? I'll take a few questions. Lights are kind of bright. I might not be able to see. Yes, sir.
Just wondering if you see a chance of a Dodd-Frank corrections bill in our lifetime.
The way I approach my congressional tenure is with high hopes and low expectations. I think the short answer is yes, elections have consequences. I think occasionally the American people may get on the wrong foot, but ultimately I believe the bulk of our people believe in American exceptionalism. And if those of us who believe fervently in free enterprise will make the case that it is not just our birthright, it is our destiny, it is our future, it is a path to prosperity, and that our lives should not be governed by those, no insult to JW or others who may have Ivy League degrees and Washington, D.C. addresses. I'm sure there's a good people, but somehow there's a certain amount of arrogance that seems to go with that combination. So as a member of Congress, every morning I have the opportunity to either get up and crawl into the fetal position and weep for all that's happening, or to put a smile on my face and fight the good fight, and I choose the latter, and I remain optimistic. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm not sure if this is on. Well, thank you for coming, Chairman. My question has to do with the Export-Import Bank. And I know it was reported in the Wall Street Journal that you held a meeting among your House Republican colleagues yesterday regarding the possible reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank. So I have two questions. The first is, how did that meeting go? What did your House Republican colleagues discuss with you on that? If you're willing to share that meeting. And then secondly, have you changed your opinion on possibly reauthorizing the Export-Import Bank with reforms? I know that Congressman John Campbell on the Financial Services Committee has offered a reform package, and that's my second question.
My, how the time flies. One, don't believe everything that you read. I did not meet with colleagues yesterday. I had an occasion to meet with some today. The purpose of the meeting was quite simple. I've had a number of members, colleagues, come up to me on the House floor to inquire why I oppose reauthorization of EXIM. And so I simply set up a meeting for those who wanted to hear why I oppose XM. It was not a debate. It was not a negotiation. It was XM 101 according to Jeb Hensarling. It was nothing more. It was nothing less. There was a lot to unpack in that question. I think somewhere embedded in that is, have I changed my mind? The short answer is no. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for being here, Chairman Hensarling. David Luttrell from the Dallas Fed. I've heard you say here tonight, and I've seen you champion in the Financial Services Committee, that Dodd-Frank has not ended too big to fail. And in fact, that was the aim of, or the clearest aim of the entire act. So what do you see as the way forward, and how do we participate in that?
Well, believe it or not, I think recently the President of the United States said something similar. I hate it when I agree with Barack Obama, but sometimes it happens. So even he, I believe, has stated, and we also know that recently Secretary Geithner, I guess also selling a book, admitted he didn't believe ultimately that we had solved the proposition of too big to fail. Number one, I don't believe any financial institution in America is too big to fail. Our financial system is too big to fail. Our country is too big to fail, but no single financial firm is too big to fail. Number one, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so, number one, we have an incredible regulatory burden to where under Dodd-Frank, the big banks have gotten bigger, the small banks have gotten fewer, and the taxpayer has gotten poorer. Number one, we need to repeal the ability of FSOC to designate SIFIs. That probably needs a translation for any viewers, but to essentially repeal the federal government's ability to designate firms as too big to fail. Second of all, we need to repeal their taxpayer-funded bailout bill. Next, it's not within the jurisdiction of my committee, but the Judiciary Committee has held a hearing, and I believe will mark up a bill along the lines of an enhanced bankruptcy, Chapter 14 bill, probably similar to what has come out of the Senate with Cornyn Toomey. I believe ultimately, if you do all of that, unless you do more to constrain the exigent powers of the Fed, 13.3, you probably haven't solved the problem. You got to do something about the exchange stabilization fund as well, that I believe has been abused in ways that are not proper or anticipated by the founders, the authors of the bill. So anyway, stay tuned. There's a number of provisions that we intend to include in our too big to fail package. It's the last major bill that will come out of our committee before the end of Congress, so I'll just leave you there wanting more.